there's a lot of that mentality, especially given that colonial history of imported wine means good wine. Mexico doesn't make wine. Mexico makes tequila. Mexico makes beer. Mexico makes mezcal. Mexico makes atol.
Really, Mexican wine coming into its own, and people and this kind of sparkling renaissance of Mexican winemaking that's profound, and are these irreplaceable, sort of amazing representations of this place. And
it's a beauty to behold. It's just sort of this permalogical ecosystem of orchards and vines, and it's absolutely stunning.
Hey friends, and welcome to the Wine CEO podcast show. I'm Sarah, your certified sommelier and host of the show, and I'm so excited because in today's episode, I'm interviewing Dale and Stephen Ott, a husband and wife sommelier duo that are making it their mission to highlight the stories of incredible winemakers in Mexico and Portugal. I learned a ton from our conversation today, and I hope you will as well. So let's dive into my conversation with Dale and Stephen Ott of Nossa Imports. Wine CEO podcast subscribers, we are so excited because today on the show, I have Dale and Stephen Ott with us. And Dale and Stephen are a husband and wife sommelier duo, and they actually own a company called Nossa Imports. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation because I do not know a ton about Mexican wine. I'll be the first to admit. I've done a little bit of my own research, but it's definitely more of an up and coming region. And Dale and Stephen are importing Mexican wines as well as Portuguese wines into the US to help American consumers learn more about the amazing regional history and incredible flavor profiles in these areas. So I'm so excited and looking forward to this conversation. And Dale and Stephen, welcome to the Wine CEO podcast.
Thank you so much. We've been looking forward to this. We're big fans of the show.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm so happy to have you. And I think what would be helpful is maybe first you could just start off talking to our listeners a little bit about yourselves, how you got into wine, how you made it to this place in the industry. Just tell us about yourselves.
Yeah. So yeah, we between the two of us, we've been in the alcohol industry a long time. I think honestly, for both of us, it started with bartending in college to pay our bills. And then since then, we've worked on all of the tiers. We've been bar managers, corporate buyers, distributors, producers, and floor sommeliers. And really what the thing that after spending a really long time in spirits and cocktails was really nice for us to get back into wine is that there's a certain amount of integrity in the business, just in the alcohol level of the wine. You know, to be quite frank, it's you can't adulterate it too much. There's just a level of honesty in wine production that was really refreshing to get back into. And so in the wine world, we feel a lot more connected with nature. We feel a lot more connected with places on earth. And it's where we're happiest. So we're definitely happy to be back on this side of the coin.
Mm-hmm. I think we both sort of came from a background where the thing that was driving us to be in the hospitality industry since we started, now a long time ago, was our how much we care about people and how much we care about connecting people. And I think the thing that we've really found in starting this company together and the thing that we found in sort of forming the connections that we've had is that in our minds, wine is one of the best ways to connect people, and the human element of wine is the thing that makes it most compelling, because it is one of humanity's first social beverages. It's one of the humanity's first sort of semi-religious, semi-cosmic, universally connecting things that gives us a window into the world. So we're excited to be doing that now for ourselves in this company.
Yeah, that's awesome. I totally agree. I feel like one of the things that really got me ingrained in wine was hearing the stories of winemakers and understanding how wine could transport you to another region, truly, right? Like getting to know the local culture, understanding why a wine tastes a certain way. You can really, in a glass, travel to another region of the world. And it's just such a cool experience. So I love that was a part of it for you guys too. Now, Nossa Imports is specifically focused on Portuguese and Mexican wines. So why those two regions? I'm so curious.
So yeah, a number of things. After a lot of years in wine and in alcohol in general, as many of us found, you sort of globally just really hear about the same 5 or 6 countries. And for us, there was a ton of the international history missing of wine. And we found a lot of those answers in Mexico and Portugal. Stephen will dive into the history a little bit, I'm sure, at some point here, but
you'd be hard pressed to stop me. I think
he's the professor. So Mexico is the the oldest New World wine producing country on earth. It has almost 500 years of growing history, and an incredible story behind that. So lots of history connecting a lot of the global story there. And then Portugal has 4,000 years of wine growing history. It has really connected the old world with the new world, 250 native varietals to the country, which makes it per capita the most native wine varietals in any country on earth. We really found a lot of those gaps sort of filled up by the stories of these two countries. Additionally, Stephen's father's side of the family is from Mexico, and we are both fluent in Spanish and Portuguese. So that does help us really get those firsthand stories in a more profound way.
That's awesome. So Stephen, I'd love to hear kind of some of the historical perspective, because it sounds like you're the expert there. So tell us a little bit about why these are important regions to even be aware of as wine consumers.
Sure. Yeah, I think really I think that there's this sort of interesting dichotomy or combination in Mexico in particular, that you know, as the new world of wine has become increasingly popular over the years, and as you know, places outside of Europe and the Middle East and North Africa have been producing wine for a long time now, it becomes more and more of the global wine story. But Mexico is unique in that in many ways it represents the very first part of that. The Spanish brought the Spanish conquistadors, when they conquered Mexico and sort of subjugated the indigenous populations there. They brought with them grapevines at the very beginning, since the 1520s. So it was very much the first place outside of those old world regions that was planted, and so in many ways you would expect it to be a way more substantial part of the conversation about New World wine. But sort of by various turns of history, it became kind of actively marginalized. And so now you see, in the last 20 years and fewer, you see really Mexican wine coming into its own, and people and this kind of sparkling renaissance of Mexican winemaking that's profound, and it comes out of this funny gap in history. It was forced by King Philip II, Felipe II, the King of Spain, after seeing how prolific Mexican winemaking was in that early part of the conquest, and the sort of mid 16th century and early 17th century. Mexico was making a tremendous amount of wine, and they were also making, frankly, quite good wine.
It was good.
And there's a lot of historical writing to this effect. But the issue was that in the system of colonialism, it was cutting into the margins that Spanish wine merchants could make with a captive market of colonized places. And so King Philip II quite famously required that all wine grapes outside of production for the use of the church had to be pulled out. They were no longer going to issue licenses for making wine, and it was prohibited from being made outside of for use in sacramental purposes. And so it went from this kind of exploding world of wine in Mexico to basically dead overnight. And it's been really interesting to see the way that Mexican winemakers have tapped into that history in a really profound way, and seen those roots, while at the same time not feeling constrained by traditions that would have been established by those early colonial periods. So yeah, it's pretty special. We're really excited about representing it. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love it. So you kind of made a comment that you feel like maybe in the last 20 years or so is really when a lot of Mexican winemakers started coming into their own and really being more known on the global scene for having excellent wine. So when did you all start importing Mexican wine to the US?
Let's see, we started about 3.5, 4 years ago. And yeah, as we actually filed our articles of organization in January of 2020. So that was an interesting time to get into global supply chain. But yeah, we've been paying attention and visiting the country for, obviously with his family, much longer than that. And obviously the Valle de Guadalupe has had wine producers there for quite some time. The second oldest winery in Mexico is one that we represent, Bodegas de Santo Tomas. And they were founded in 1888, with their vineyard being founded in 1791. So there's quite a deep history there. But we really have seen the last 20 years, it's absolutely exploded.
I'm just curious what type of like resistance maybe you've run into, because I feel like even though folks who are very familiar with the Mexican wine industry understand that in the last 20 years, there's been this resurgence. I would say that maybe the average American consumer is more like in the last 3 to 5 years, they've started realizing that Mexico is actually a great wine region. And there's even some consumers I speak with today that are like, wait, Mexico and wine? No. So I think it's still a bit of an up and coming region. So have you experienced resistance around people being really hesitant to try Mexican wines?
Yes, and I know we both have answers to this, and I'm imagining since at this point we sort of, being business partners and husband and wife, we have a communal brain.
We share one between
We
us.
do. It makes us one complete person, but I would say that that's a multifaceted answer. For many years, the target market for Mexican wines was Mexico, which makes a lot of sense. However, and I know Stephen's going to be speaking to this. In many ways, the Mexican market, I think for a lot of Mexican producers, has been the most challenging one. There's a lot of that mentality, especially given that colonial history of imported wine means good wine. Mexico doesn't make wine. Mexico makes tequila. Mexico makes beer. Mexico makes mezcal. Mexico makes atol. So that has started to slowly change. There's been a lot of infrastructure from companies like Provino that puts on the Festivales de la Vendimia in Baja every year. There's a lot of organizations that are really starting to get the story out and to get Mexico to actually consume its own wine. And I feel like that's similar for a lot of places. I know being in Arizona, there are some wines that are coming from our state that are beautiful, and Arizonans are the hardest clients to sell on that. So it makes sense, but I think that's been a really big hurdle. And in that mentality inside of the country, I think that's been contagious internationally. We don't make wine, we make these things. And that's been a hurdle for a lot of people to get over.
Yeah. I think that's a fair assessment. And I think it's also, the domestic, it was interesting. I was reading a little while back, an earlier edition of the Wines of North America, the Jancis Robinson sort of co-authored book about sort of North America as a whole, as a wine growing region. And there's maybe 3/4 of a page section on Mexico. That basically, but there's an interesting statistic then, because it was published in the late 80s, I think. And it made the observation that per capita consumption of wine in Mexico was a little less than a glass of wine per person per year. Which in the 80s, which is a very low per capita consumption of wine.
That's
especially
crazy.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
I'm shocked.
Yeah. And so that was, that was a primary concern, right? With such a minimal domestic market for consumption in Mexico, there were very few producers. It didn't seem like it was a viable place to be doing it, just by the sheer economics of it. But the interesting thing is that over the course of the last 20, like I said, 20 years, from that point, the per capita consumption has more than doubled. It's almost tripled at this point, which is still relatively low given sort of the global average for consumption of wine.
And how much we all think about how many glasses of wine we have a year.
Yeah.
Right?
Be rude to count, I think.
Yes. I was just thinking the same.
No.
But that's been a significant change, and I think, but I think there's a cultural resistance, I think, that has been sort of slowly overcome. And then beyond that, I think that in perfect candor, I think that there is an expectation, given the sort of the nature of the tourist trade between the United States and Mexico historically, and sort of the nature of our particular and fraught international relationship, that there's an expectation on the part of American consumers that there is a acceptable threshold for price and quality for Mexican products, which I think I'm very grateful in many ways to see that has been changing substantially over the last number of years. But I still think that's been a hurdle to come over. The fact that Mexican wines aren't hugely inexpensive as a whole. Some are, some aren't, but it's been contrary to people's expectations about what they think should come out of a place. But the truth is, it's like any wine growing region, right? There's costs that are intrinsically associated with it, and it's a question of time and investment to make products that are worthwhile. And Mexico really is doing those things in spades.
Agreed.
That's awesome. That's so good. Glad to hear. So I did a series a few months ago on Greece, and that's another region that for, a long time, it had early history of making wine, but then for a long time really was not considered a global superpower in making wine. And they're coming, more to the front center stage. And one of the things that helped with that was the winemakers really coming together and organizing and focusing on particular grape varieties and focusing on their marketing. So where is the Mexican industry with that? Do you feel like there is an organization between winemakers trying to push particular varieties? Is it still a bit of the wild, wild west where they're figuring it out? What are you seeing?
Both. So yes, both things. One of the things that speaking to the wild, wild west part of it, one of the things that we do love about Mexico right now is that there aren't any appellations yet. There are no DOs. There's no governmentally designated areas because, as we mentioned, they are sort of getting their sea legs back in this renaissance of harboring back to, the ancestral methods and techniques while looking towards the future. So while that's happening, there's a lot of research happening with international varietals, with ones that have been there the longest, seeing which ones are going to work and that are going to really paint the landscape for each different region that's growing wine in Mexico to have its sort of be known for. Two of the grapes that we can very much speak to specifically in Baja, in northern Baja, where about 75% of Mexico's total wine production comes from, are the grapes Mission and Chenin Blanc, surprisingly. For us, those are definitely going to be two of the power grapes that state and that Mexico then in turn is going to be really known for. To speak to Chenin Blanc first, I know that's sort of a surprise. There's we think Chenin, we think France, we think South Africa. The Chenins that are coming out of Mexico are, in a word, stunning. They are, I have goosebumps talking about it. They are absolutely gorgeous wines. To me, they have a lot of things in common with a Gruner. They have sort of that thicker mouthfeel. They have really, really bright acidity in a place that is quite hot, but does get big temperature swings given the coastal climate. I've never had Chenins before in my entire career as a wine professional that like the ones that are coming from Baja. And I think those are ones to really be on the lookout for. Speaking to Mission, so Mission is a really fascinating grape. It's a very light red. It's one that people, it's when it's made into a dry wine, it's one that people can chill and sort of have in the summertime as something a little bit lighter, but not quite rosé. It was actually the first Vitis vinifera, the first winemaking grape ever to be planted in what's now the United States. And the people that planted it, the missionaries that were working up their way up the Pacific coast in Mexico, planted it in Mexico first. So it's the same people that were establishing all these wine regions 200, 300 years ago that came over the border, planted the first Vitis vinifera, which is Mission in what's now the state of California. And this really started the wine industry in North America. So it's pretty, that's our history in a glass is Mission, and it's just a delightful summer red.
It's beautiful.
That rocks, to be perfectly frank.
Yeah. It's also known as País. It comes from the same genetic parent as País in South America, although the clones and sort of the changes of it have been substantially different as it existed in Mexico for several hundred years. But it's really stunning, and it really does speak to this deep history, this deep well of history that I think we're excited to be seeing. To your question about the organization, I think that there is the thing that's been really beneficial, and I think the thing that we're really seeing a lot of international recognition about is whereas it's maybe not in the same way that the Greeks organized really well around certain varietals, or with indigenous varietals from Greece that they've really started to push out into the global world, into the global wine scene. Mexico has been really more focused on regions, and the organization that they've been doing around wine growing regions and the sort of cooperative marketing groups and sort of organizational groups that are individually forming between producers, like Provino in Baja California, the various wine growing groups in Queretaro, Guanajuato, Parras, Valle de Parras, where the oldest winery in North America is from, and the Casa Madero. They're the ones that are really doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of embracing this period of exploration that kind of necessarily needs to happen as these regions sort of explore the potential for various grapes in these places, and seeing what they do, and then but at the same time really advocating for what the terroir of those regions is, and advocating for the sort of the special and unique voice that they can add to the conversation about wine globally, because that's that's the thing that's really that I think people are finding compelling, as evidenced by the fact that in this last the Brussels concourse, international concourse of wine, the highest ranking wine for the entire competition this year was a Mexican white wine. And that sort of advocacy about not necessarily saying these are the indigenous grapes of this place, because that tradition that would be, with the exception maybe of Mission, that would be maybe challenging.
King Philip II was a real jerk about that.
Yeah. but saying being able to have that conversation about the regions themselves, I think is really valuable, and we really admire and appreciate the work that people are doing in that regard, with those sort of grower groups.
And just sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
As a small piece to add on to that, something that I do always like to mention when we're talking about wine regions in Mexico, and obviously Baja is really sort of the epicenter. I know a lot of people have heard of the Valle de Guadalupe, but it's one of 5 valleys that surround Ensenada that are winemaking valleys. And so each valley has its own specific and fierce regional terroir that's starting to really develop. And that just surprises a lot of people. So I always like to just wiggle that in there.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad you did, because I was going to ask kind of a similar question. So that's perfect. I was going to ask, if you had to highlight for our listeners, maybe the top 3 regions to keep an eye out for. You mentioned Baja, you mentioned Valle de Guadalupe, but what would you say are kind of top 3 to keep an eye out on?
Guanajuato, I would definitely say so. San Miguel de Allende in central Mexico. There is a pretty hardy wine growing region that is one of the oldest in the country. It's in the heart of the Valley of Independence. Guanajuato is an absolutely beautiful state, and I'm sure we've all either been to or seen pictures of their famous city, and it's stunning. It's a much smaller growing and producing region than Baja is. At this point, there's less than 100 producers that are established there, but we are importing one wine from there with more on the way. And I think Guanajuato wines are really showing some personality and some more tapping into some old world ideals that I find very appealing.
I'd also, and sort of connected with Guanajuato, I'd say Queretaro, the state of Queretaro, it has quite an established history. The Frégenet, the historically Spanish producer, has had for quite a long time a sparkling producing house in Queretaro. They've been making wine there for quite some time, but Queretaro is really, really well established in terms of the production of wine in Mexico. And I think that it's, given its proximity, it's about an hour drive between the city of Queretaro and the city of San Miguel. So it really in general forms a sort of a region that I think ties into each other in a pretty prolific way.
It's also not so far from Mexico City. It's a little bit north. And so that's something that when people have already been to Baja and they want to understand more about Mexican wine growing and wine regions, we love to direct them to central Mexico. There's so much happening there.
They actually, and it's interesting, they're to those groups that I was talking about before, they're starting to kind of organize geographically based around the geology and they call it the Bajió region, the Bajió of the Central Mexican Plateau, which encompasses both Querétaro and Guanajuato. People are surprised the elevation of that region is higher than Denver.
Yeah.
It's and that's the reason that so far south you're able to get really, really expressive wines with tons of acidity and brightness. Another region that I mentioned is Parras, is the Valle de Parras in Coahuila. Where Casa Madero is, but where there's a lot of up and coming wineries, and some, within that 20-year range, a lot have popped up that are making really beautiful wines. And it's further north, a border state, but making exceptional wines.
And
that's awesome.
Obviously Baja.
That's awesome. And you talked about kind of directing people to certain regions. So what is wine tourism like right now in Mexico? I mean, is it still kind of scratching the surface, trying to figure it out? Or, I mean, can you go on vacation and have a lot of opportunities to go to the cellar door, stay at wineries?
Are you tired of me saying both yet?
Not at all. Go for it, Dale.
So in Baja definitely has the most established wine tourism, and specifically in our major valley there, the Valle de Guadalupe, there is a lot of tourism set up. You can stay at a lot of different wineries. There are many tour companies that are an easy Google search away that speak multiple different languages, have all sorts of capacity and facilities to even guide you down from the airport to get you over the border. There's a lot that is already established. In Guanajuato, a lot is getting more established. More of that is there are some companies that will tour you around, and there are definitely wineries that you can stay on premise. But it is a little bit more of a you contact the winery sort of a one-off deal. And I would say the same for Queretaro and Coahuila as well.
Yeah.
I think that it's there, but it's not necessarily as cohesive as say some like a Napa.
That said, we we're happy to facilitate if folks are interested in that sort of thing. That's exactly the kind of stuff that we think is really important. Our business partner in Mexico, our Matilde Oldenburg, she's a winemaker there who sort of acts as our boots on the ground and helps us with logistics and various other things. But she also runs a tour company in Baja. So that's one that we can connect people with directly. But we're also any trepidation about organizing that, it's super easy to rent a car at the airport in Querétaro and make the drive yourself and visit as many wineries as you'd like in central Mexico. Similarly in Coahuila, there's a lot of potential for it. It just takes a smidge more planning.
And to be a little bit more clear about that as well, we actually have an email. It's experiences@nosaimports.com. And because in both countries, we're working in wine regions that don't necessarily have quite as established of wine tourism structures set up, we work with a large number of third-party services in every region from which we import wine to be able to connect people to the right person to get tours going, logistics, pickups, reservations, all sorts of those things. So yes, we like to act as the middleman so we can help open those doors for sure.
That's amazing. I will definitely include that email and all the information that you mentioned in the show notes for today's episode, because I'm sure there will be folks that want to take you up on that. How about if we can't travel, how would we be able to try some of the wines that you're importing?
Absolutely. So currently, our wines are for sale in the state of Arizona, in bars, restaurants, and shops. We are in the process of launching in 6 states in the next 6 months. And our focus is for the next little while on the western side of the United States. We are a relatively new company in that we have our sales have been in existence now for just about a year. So we're launching with a number of third-party services to be able to facilitate direct-to-consumer shipping, which is, speaking of the Wild West during COVID, that was definitely the Wild West for a while, and then there were a lot of regulations that kind of got smacked down. So we're rebuilding from where we got cut off on a few pathways.
That being said, we also I want to maybe foolishly, but I think importantly, plug some of the other folks that are doing the work in this field as well.
Absolutely.
There's some other really great importers that are working to bring these products to the US. La Competencia Imports based in California, represents a large portfolio of Mexican wines that are really lovely, varied, and stunning. I believe they have direct consumer through their website, but if not, I'm sure they'd be happy for contact. Beso Imports, based in Washington, is doing some great stuff, and also definitely has a online wine store called Wines of Mexico.
LMA,
La Misión, yeah,
as well. Michelle, she's based in California, and she has an online wine shop as well. All of them are going to have different states that they're able to ship and deliver to, but that will say directly on their websites. And yeah, I guess I would just say in the next year, stay tuned for ours.
That's awesome. Well, I will definitely make sure that I include all of the contact information for your website and everything so that folks can keep following along. And hopefully as your import business continues to grow, there will be even more states that we can all get your wine in. Because I think, folks are very curious to try something different. We've all had a million Chardonnays, a million Cabernet Sauvignons, but there's some really exciting wines out there that, thanks to individuals like you, consumers are starting to learn more about, because, there's some great winemakers that are making some really really unique things around the world. And there'd be no way for consumers to find out about them if it wasn't for individuals like you that are making it your mission to really highlight these stories. And with that, I'd love to hear, is there maybe one winemaker or one story that's really maybe touched you recently, where you have someone who has really just been, they have a special story that you'd love to share with us?
Yes. He is the absolute best, and I'm gonna let you.
Okay. Are you sure?
Oh, totally. Ugh, we adore him.
Yeah. So we feel so strongly about everyone that we work with, and have taken a lot of time to be very specific about forming partnerships that we deeply believe in. One of the kind of best examples of that, and someone that we feel so strongly about, is Juan Carlos Bravo. His winery is called JC Bravo, because he's the founder, and really the whole thing centers around this one man. The reason that I think he's important, and the reason that I think his story is so compelling, is that as of right now, I think you check me on the number, it's like 270 plus wineries in the Valle de Guadalupe, or in the greater Valle de Guadalupe area, that area of northern Baja. And of that large group of wineries, when he founded his winery, he was the first person who was born and raised in the Valle de Guadalupe, founding it as a founding winemaker, to open a winery and have him be a local boy from that place.
He was the only one.
It is, and it's sort of an interesting story. He was, his parents and his grandfather and his parents came to the Valle, to Baja, to northern Baja in the 1940s. They came sort of as part of this program where they were really expanding the agricultural production in the area. And one of the major jobs that people had there, one of the major productive crops, was selling grapes to the larger wineries that were already established there as contract growers. And so he and his family came there. They planted their vineyards in those early days, and was a contract grower for many years, until the sort of late 80s, when the repercussions of the debt crisis and changing economics really shut everything down. And so the vast majority of growers, all of their opportunities started drying up. There was no one buying their grapes anymore. He was growing varietals that weren't Chardonnay, Cab Sauv, Pinot Noir, or Sauvignon Blanc. And so he was basically being told, we'll maybe buy your grapes, but we're going to pay you a fraction of what they're worth. You won't be able to survive on it. So everyone around him either pulled out their vines and planted something else, or tried to regraft international varietals that didn't do very well in the region, or whatever it was. And basically Juan Carlos made the decision that he was going to not do that he was going to try a different tact. And so, with the help of a winemaker named Hugo da Costa, who was known as sort of the godfather of the Valle de Guadalupe, and founded La Escuelita, a winemaking school in the area, Juan Carlos learned how to make wine from nothing, as a farmer who, by his own admission, only drank Tecate, and really didn't care for wine. He taught himself how to make wine from scratch, and is now exclusively doing that with his family. The reason that it's important is that he is one of the only winemakers that's running that is dry farming his vines. So they're entirely unirrigated. There is no irrigation. It's only the rainwater that's watering the vines, which would be impossible at this point in Baja. But these 14 hectares of vineyards that he has, that are that he planted that grew up with his parents, with his grandfather and his father, are these irreplaceable, sort of amazing representations of this place. And
it's a beauty to behold. It's just sort of this permalogical ecosystem of orchards and vines, and it's absolutely stunning. Untrained,
dry farmed bush vines, so they're just planted in the ground, growing free. He and his family are tending them. The amount of labor that goes into it is exceptional, and the only people that do any of the work for him are him, his nephew, his son, and his daughters. So it's about 6 total people that do all of the work for these wines. He grows Carignan and Palomino Fino. He makes 2 wines, a white and a red. Is now making a rosé out of the Carignan, and exploring some other options. But in terms of he makes wines out of the grapes that he grows. The current vintage for the Carignan is a 2016, because he's out of these old vine dry farm Carignan grapes. He's doing a wine with such vision that he won't release it until almost 6 years after he makes it.
It's like a champagne producer. He makes wine for the future.
Because-
It's unbelievable.
Because he knows it won't be ready.
Mhm.
It's a treasure, truly, and his wines are exceptional. We can't speak highly enough of them, and he's the absolute loveliest man who must be protected at all costs. But,
I just adore him.
yeah.
I love that. What a great way to be able to experience the true expression of a local terroir, right? And just the commitment that he's had to the history and the specific region. That is so cool. Well, he sounds amazing. And I'll definitely make sure that I link his information in today's show notes as well for our listeners so they can check it out because he sounds wonderful. Dale and Stephen, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much. I know I learned a ton and I hope the listeners did as well. We will definitely stay tuned for all the exciting things happening with Nossa Imports in the near future. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you
Sarah.
so much, Sarah.
Friends, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Dale and Stephen. It was such a fun one for me. I'm really excited to try some Mexican wines and add Mexico to my travel bucket list. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any questions at all about this episode or wine in general, you can always send me an email, sarah@thewineceo.com, or send me a message on Instagram @thewineceo. Until next week, friends, I hope you drink something new and delicious, and I will catch you all in the next episode of the Wine CEO podcast.